So moving on to the sort of main body of the call, I did send through those sort of rough bullet points of the way we could structure it or to help guide us, but really it's meant to be quite informal and we can go wherever the discussion takes us. But I thought with rewilding, which some of you already mentioned, I think it's always really important that you define what you mean by rewilding before, at the start of any conversation on it, because everyone has their own interpretation and definition, and there's quite a lot of different definitions that are out there. It's useful to define it at the start so you actually know what it is you're talking about. So I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to go start with that, or I can give you what I think is my definition, but if someone else wants to start. Hannah, yeah?
Well, I could start because mine's really simple. So the way I say it is giving nature back the tools that it needs to heal itself. And that's kind of my top line definition.
Okay, and Pete, you've got something to say on that?
Yeah, I'll actually broadly agree with that. I think part of the problem comes from when you're asking whether you want rewilding as a scientific definition or a cultural definition, which I think, as Hannah and Alice have touched on, it is a philosophy as much as it is a method. And actually, it's tricky to define it from a scientific point of view. If you want a baseline, when it first originated, it was in the 90s. It was Nos with the cores, corridors, and carnivores concept, whereby rewilding was you have a big core area, you have these connecting strands to these core areas, and on top of that, you have your large carnivores, which then create that trophic cascade to basically regulate that ecosystem. That was applying it to a North American wilderness concept. So then, of course, when you then try applying rewilding to someone's estate in Surrey, it's not exactly going to be the same cores, corridors, carnivores. So I think for me, it is a philosophy of, giving nature the tools, giving nature the driving seat, basically. That philosophy is going to vary depending on where it is. Ideally, if you can do cores, corridors, carnivores, and people are happy with that, then that should be it. But, if we're talking about wilding in an urban context, it's maybe not having restrictive mowing regimes or stuff like that. But obviously it's still going to have some regulation on top of that, and you might not be able to have all those key species. So it's a philosophy about giving nature the driving seat rather than us being pernickety about what should be there and what shouldn't be there, basically.
Yeah, no, thank you. For me, two of the best sort of points that I had was a talk by Charley Miller at NEP, and he gave two core principles, which I sort of see as two of the main driving principles of rewilding. And the first is minimal intervention. So you try and intervene in the landscape or the site as a human being as little as possible. And also then the second principle being process-led. You're led by ecological processes, not by your own ideas or management plan or species targets. And I think if you take those two principles, they're something I think should be key to all forms of rewilding. And then I think it's also a lot of people on Twitter have started sharing sort of graphs and different infographics that show rewilding as a scale. And so that's another useful way of viewing it, in that there can be degrees of rewilding. It's not just sort of a hard, is it rewilding or isn't it? You can sort of move up and down that scale. Anyone else want to? Alasdair?
Hi there. Yeah, I broadly agree with all that, and I think you're right. It has a scale, and in one end, the ultimate objective always has to be wild, unmanaged land in its a wilderness. That's the ultimate mental objective. Of course, we recognize that getting to that stage may take forever. It may never happen again in some places, but that's the kind of but yeah, there's steps on that way, and I think you're absolutely right. It's about minimal intervention. I think it's about process. It's also, I think it should be open-ended. So you don't want a fixed outcome. One of the biggest problems we have in this country, in my opinion, is that most conservation and land management has been done with a fixed outcome. So you'll have two bits of land right next to each other where I live. One is managed by one NGO, one is managed by another NGO, both the same land, completely different outcomes, because one is being managed for, I don't know, butterflies, the other one's being managed for hawks. Do you know what I mean? It's just a completely different, and and they'll have conflicting regimes, and that's fine, but it's a different kind of thing. I think the other thing as well is it's simply about creating space for nature to do its stuff. I guess that's what Heel's saying. A certain degree of humility is necessary, because very often we don't know what species need. So we often get these arguments. People say, oh, we have to do this to help X species. Well, we actually don't know that a lot of the time, because very often we're wrong. Because if we were right, we wouldn't be seeing a lot of the problems we're seeing in wildlife in the UK now. But also, I think totally agree about the cultural movement aspect. People have been asking me to define rewilding for about 10 years. And I always think that, you can't define punk very well, or hip hop, or impressionism, but they're incredibly powerful movements in our society. And I think from my mind, that's a lot of where I see the power of rewilding is it's about this idea that's not just a kind of, to me, conservation's done a good job at kind of building up the walls to keep a few areas safe. But it's, rewilding is about something different. It's about actually saying we can create something much bigger and more hopeful than that. So to me, that element is really crucial to it. Without that, it doesn't really work.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Another thing that occurred to me last night, I'm reading a book called Taming the Flood by Jeremy Purse-Glove about the history of, sort of flooding and drainage. And I've only just started it, but he was talking about the long, long history of drainage in the UK, going back to hundreds and hundreds of years, starting with the monks and things like this. And it linked to something which occurred to me when I was working on Dartmoor as well, that a lot of our landscapes, the legacy of human impact is incredibly long. And I think it made me think that the idea of the part of rewilding, about going back, always seems a little bit problematic to me, because in a way rewilding isn't really about looking back, because it's really difficult to know which point in time in the past you're actually going back to, but it's about looking forward. It's about almost ignoring the past in some ways, although we look to the past when we think about species reintroductions and things like that. But it's about saying, well, let's see what the land of today can produce itself. It kind of doesn't really necessarily matter what the past was like. It matters what it will do next, in a way. I don't know what anyone else thought about that. Alasdair, Stuart, do you want to go first? And then.
Yeah, I think it's quite a good point that Alasdair made, is that having been involved in lots and lots of projects in the past, they tend to have 5-year lifespans, and that's purely down to financial, generally European funding. So sort of long term, we don't have long term visions in practice in the UK. They generally are 5, and especially when you're dealing with EU finance, then you're getting audited on everything, and it's generally where you put the signs rather than what you've actually produced. So, but conservation generally in the UK is species specific, and that's one of the biggest issues. And I live right in the middle of some of the most designated land in the UK, and it's all based around key species, not the habitat. And I think NGOs tend to be at odds with each other on this. So one of the things I was involved in, and it's sort of changed name now, was Futurescapes, which is an RSPB project, which is up here is now it's now evolved into Cairngorms Connect. So it's a landscape scale conservation project. So it's pretty big. But in taking all that, is rewilding the correct term? I'm probably going to be one of the unpopular ones by saying I hate the term, because what is rewild? What's wild? I personally think Govan in Glasgow's wild. That's my, that's wild. I don't see our natural landscapes as wild. Are we naturalizing or whatever? But I think it's the the wording that we use. Some people say it's not important. I think it is, because especially in the Highlands, with local people, it carries huge negative connotations. and a lot of that has become because of things like large-scale deer culls, taking sheep off the hill, things like that. And I think part of the issue is actually communicating what you want to do. And I think that's probably, in my mind, one of the biggest things, because every rewilding project has a management plan. Can you think anything that, if we're not managing it, why have we got a managing plan? And do we walk away? Do we walk away and we do manage it? Our biggest projects are up here involved huge deer reduction programs. That's an immensely big piece of management. I'll stop there. I'm going to start a rant.
Alasdair, did you want to just come in there?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I don't want to talk too much, but first of all, I'm going to agree with you. I've always thought rewilding is not about going backwards; it's about going forwards completely. And especially with climate change now, the idea of going backwards is, there is no set point we can go back to anyway. So we take inspiration from the past, and we maybe use that for our idea of what species are native and so on. But it is about creating something, and the part personally, I always thought as much applied to ourselves as to the land. But anyway. I do agree partly with Stewart about the idea of definitions, but I also think it's a very insider track way of looking at it. I think for most people, when you talk about rewilding, they kind of get emotionally what it means, perhaps more than they get, the fundamental of different management plans. And I think there's also a problem though. We say, oh, people don't like it because it's controversial, because it's rewilding. Actually, it's not the word they don't like. They don't like the fact that you're talking about taking sheep off the hills, or that you're talking about land use changes or changes in power dynamics. And I think you could call it anything and some people would object to it, So in a way, it's not the word there, it's the fact that you're actually talking about some quite significant changes to what you would like to see the countryside look like. Doesn't mean you've got the power to do it, you're going to do it, but that is, if we're honest, we would like to see some significant changes. And yeah, a lot of rewilding schemes do have management plans, but I suspect sometimes they have more management plans than perhaps they need. And that's a hangover from the people doing it, are bringing with them all their conservation baggage. But it's also because we're working with a very incomplete form of rewilding in this country, because we're starting from such a distant baseline from where we kind of would like to be. But yeah, I'll stop there. But I think we need to separate out the unpopularness of the term from the unpopularness of what you're actually doing, if you see what I mean, to some people.
Charley?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because where we are, so in Wiltshire, I didn't mention that, but I'm working with the kinds of people that I work with. It's almost the opposite. Like, it has a very positive with a lot of people without the understanding behind it. I'm interested to hear everyone who's spoken about the definition of rewilding being so flexible about it. My view of it and my feelings towards it have changed quite a lot over the years. Like, I first went to a rewilding conference in 2015, and there was so much disagreement on what it meant. And then most recently I went to a talk in Oxford, and they were very, it was an academic thing through the uni, I think, and talking about European projects and things, and they were quite, rewilding is these large-scale NEP style projects. So it's great to be flexible about the term, but it also makes it a bit difficult. And so when I am asked about rewilding during quite a kind of time pressure date, I don't feel like I have the time to get into a conversation about it. I'm thinking maybe I need to make the time or take the time to have those discussions, because so many people are interested in it and supporting it without being clear on what it means. So I know of a local, I don't know if it's a charity, but non-profit organisation who are called Rewilding something, and they're about human rewilding. So it's all about connecting people with the natural world. So that's kind of adding more confusion, in my opinion. But I'm not saying it's a negative thing, it's just confusing to me.
Who got there first, Pete or Hannah? Hannah, do you want to go first?
I was just going to add that the definition of rewilding has been something that we talk a lot about at HEAL as a new organisation, only been around for about a month, trying to make sure that our message is really, really clear to all of our supporters about what we mean by rewilding. And I started off with a very kind of purist point of view, which was that so when I first heard about rewilding, it was from Rewilding Britain, and they had you can only rewild when you have this much land, and it was a very clear definition. If you're going to restore the ecological processes, you need it to be on a large scale. There were certain conditions. And now that I look at the new definition of rewilding from Rewilding Britain, it doesn't, from what I see, state, I think it was 100 hectares or 100 acres, I can't remember, 100,000, sorry. But they were very prescriptive in what it meant. And then so I came at it from that point of view. And when I would see rewilding used, it would overlap with kind of habitat management. So I saw something from Somerset Wildlife Trust, I think it was, and they said, or Avon, and it said that they were so pleased to see Bristol Council rewilding their rivers. And what they were doing was reprofiling the rivers and changing the paths and adding some benches. And I saw that and I thought, that's not rewilding. And to me, it was annoying because I felt that it was diluting the definition of rewilding. But over a bit of time, I've changed my opinion about it a little bit in terms of what rewilding means culturally and as a movement for kind of individuals. And I think that I'm getting less strict about how I use rewilding, because everyone sort of, I think to get people behind it, everyone needs to be able to rewild to a certain extent. And I think as long as we have the end goal being that places are wilder and more diverse and more natural, generally that's kind of okay. But it's really hard to define because, conservation driven by human activity with a specific end goal to me isn't rewilding. So it's difficult, but yeah, anything that kind of inspires people to change or to rewild themselves, for me, is kind of okay.
Yeah, Pete, did you want to say something?
Points to both Charlie and Hannah on that front. So when Charlie mentioned some European projects, I think it's a good place to sort of lead into where some confusion has arisen as well. So a lot of the European projects that are brought up are what the Dutch actually called nature development, which started up around the 80s and 90s. And that's based with some similar principles to rewilding. They're working the idea of going to no management, going for a nature-led philosophy. But their idea was based more or less on a single theory that Europe was once wood pasture maintained by large herbivores. Now, whether it actually was that case, there's actually evidence that does stack against it. And what's probably more likely is nature's a most area. There would have been open areas, but there would have been closed areas as well and whatnot. But a lot of government officials seem to run with this idea. And let's create some fenced reserves with lots of domestic cattle, domestic horses, rare breed domestic cattle and horses that are very hardy, things like your Hex and your Conic ponies, but domestics nonetheless, often lots in a relatively small area. So already you've got a small area with probably a high density of large herbivores you otherwise find, with no large carnivores creating an eutrophic process as well. So while there have been benefits of species and habitats on these things, it's also arguable how nature-led that really is, when ultimately, you're actually creating a bit of an imbalance in some way. That's a philosophy that's taken to NEP in the UK as well. But of course, NEP do manage their stock very carefully. But they don't overmanage them so they turn the site into complete grassland, and they don't undermanage them. They don't undermanage them so it turns into complete grassland, and don't overmanage them so it becomes full woodland. They still go for principle. So whilst NEP does still work on rewilding principles, it does still have that management in place. And my worry is that with traditional conservation being this idea of using grazing animals to maintain the habitats, which in reality is sort of low intensity farmland. So, I love going to a chalk down, and I love Heathland, I have strong child memories of these places, and you do get some wonderful wildlife there. But this is where wildlife has been pushed into essentially low density farming habitats that we would have had in abundance, 1,000 years ago. That's our baseline, but they're not necessarily natural led. And as soon as you have theories saying that you need domestic herbivores to maintain this, I do worry whether traditional conservation will jump rewilding as that being their key for it, and actually just keep doing more of the same. We've got to be aware that yes, grazing is a natural process, and replacing the functions of lost herbivores kind of a place, but you've got to be really careful on the scale and density of the animals you're using. And I think that comes into the point Hannah's making on sort of diluting terms and things, and also some point I made at the start about where reintroductions fit into it. You know, I've heard dormouse reintroduction being described as rewilding. People who have been reintroducing dormice years for rewilding became a popular term, and that reintroduction often happens in managed coppice woodland itself, a sort of man-made modification to a natural habitat, which then needs to be maintained in order to keep those dormouse populations going well. That's not rewilding at all. So while we do need to be flexible in the philosophy of rewilding, because, you know, like nature, it is varied, it's balanced, it has, you know, it's different sets of rules, if you like, in different contexts. Equally, we shouldn't be calling everything, because then if you call it everything, it becomes nothing. And be quite sort of careful on that front.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we've spent quite a bit of time on the definition, and I'm happy to carry on, but often I think that can be one of the more boring bits, but it's important and we have to talk about that. And I think that was useful, and I hope that's helped us all think about what are the key underlying concepts of rewilding, what we might actually be referring to when we talk about it. If everyone's happy, we could maybe move on to talk about some of the positives of rewilding. So as we all see them as individuals, so what we think it could offer us in this country, what things might benefit, what we might gain from it, both in terms of the wildlife, but also, as some of you said, the cultural aspect and the wildness that might sort of inspire in ourselves. So who wants to start on that then? Positives. Alasdair, go on then. Oh, yeah.
Let Stewart go first. He had his hand up first, I think. He's just lower down than me.
Oh, go on, Stewart.
Yeah, I think if we look at examples that we have already, just from personal experience, sometimes it can be sort of counterproductive. So about 5-6 miles from me, we have Glenfeshie, which you know, many of you will know about, and what we have is that we've got a forest that's now regenerating. It's looking good. Arguments of whether the management in place is actually rewilding or whatever, that's another one. But what has happened is that when these spots become, once the process is started and people see the benefits of regeneration and things, obviously it gets some media hype. So that's great, people talk about it, and now everybody wants to go there. So we've got this rewilding area that now has some of the highest visitor numbers in Scotland. And it's how do we manage these areas once we're kind of creating honeypots. And that is, I think we've seen, is that with the travel restrictions that we've got at the moment, just actually obviously there's no one going out doing any wildlife surveys and things. I can only tell you by walking my dog on a short lead through these areas that, you know, woodland grouse have started using the forest completely different this year than they have in the last few. So I'm actually forgetting where I started here, but if we actually look at, you know, the human element is really number one, I think, is that how do people interact with these rewilded areas, and where do we go with that? How do we manage it? Because certainly in Scotland, our land access legislation doesn't allow us to shut areas down. Yeah, I don't know if that was an answer or a thought or what it was, but anyway.
Oh yeah, Alasdair, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think that's quite interesting, because that's almost the opposite of what I was going to say, but the same thing in the same way. I think for me, the most, because this is the good things about rewilding, I mean, the first thing is I think it gives people hope. It's been such a powerful message of hope for people. You know, and I was growing up in this country and in Ireland as well. Real wildlife was something that happened somewhere else. I mean, I have to be honest, like landscapes like the South Downs one leave me totally cold. because they, to me, were almost entirely lifeless, grazed by sheep, a few little butterflies, a few little flowers, a few little birds. And I just found this, frankly, this huge sense of loss, that wildlife was just something that didn't happen where I lived, or it happened at such a small scale. And all of the interventions and campaigns when I was growing up were things that were of such a domestic nature and such a small scale nature. It was hard to get that excited about them. Like, I was interested. I was always interested in animals, obviously. And I was always interested in the idea that we should, create space and conserve the good things that were left. But it seemed that we were doing it on such a small scale, and the areas that we were conserving were such tiny fragments. It really just felt kind of heartbreaking. And so real wildlife was something that had to happen somewhere else. And then I started working in and going to other places, and I realized that actually what we were conserving was often failure. First of all, we were conserving what happens when you burn down a rainforest in India. You get something that looks quite a lot like some of our managed lands, with a few species that do very well out of it, but most don't. Actually, there's quite a lot of species do very well in palm oil plantations, incidentally, but we shouldn't conserve them for that reason. And I thought that, for me, rewilding was just a thunderbolt. It was a thunderbolt of hope. And it was about the idea, not of any set of rules or protocols, but quite simply about the idea that we could make things better. We could bring back species that have been lost and let them do their thing. We could turn land over to nature and natural processes and let it do its thing, frankly, and if it was a small scale or a big scale, we could just start that process of restoration. And I always felt that not only, there was so many good things it could achieve in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem services, but ultimately it would make us so much happier. And I think for a lot of people, that's really, really resonated. And what Stewart's saying, I think, confirms that. When you label an area rewilding, people want to go see it because they want to see that sense of hope and that message, So I think that is a problem. That's a challenge. How do you manage that? But I would argue that's a challenge for any high wildlife successful area. They have the same problems in Kanha National Park in India, or Periyar, or Ranthambore, or anywhere there's lots of stuff. It's how do you then start to manage the visitor numbers? It's the same as Stonehenge, I suppose. And I guess hopefully the more you get, and the more rewilding you get, and the more that you can start to make wildlife an everyday occurrence, maybe we can start to try and find a way to reduce those pressures. Though I accept in the short term it's going to be a big problem. So for me, that's the single most exciting thing about rewilding, is that idea of hope. When I bought my land, Natural England told me, pick a species and manage for it. That's their advice. That was their advice. And I thought, that's ranching. Anyone can do that. Anyone can pick a species and maximize for it. So what? That's not creating that's not in any way restoring a natural ecosystem. And it seems pretty uninspiring to the soul, to be honest. So I think rewilding is about something bigger than that. That's my thoughts on it. The good things.
Cool, thank you, Alasdair. I'll just also say welcome to Megan, who you can see has just joined. Megan, we've just finished sort of talking a bit about how we all might define rewilding and what it means. We've now moved on to what the positives of rewilding are as we see them, just so you know where we are with the discussion. Does anyone want to go next with some more positives, or to respond to anything that was just said? Hannah?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Alasdair said, really, about the potential it has to inspire people. So obviously it's not actually a new concept, but it's only gained popularity recently. And there's just something about the rewilding movement that's captured people's imaginations that otherwise wouldn't normally be involved in conservation or interested in it, I think. There's something about it that's just new, that just seems like a glimmer of hope. And so when we launched only a month ago, since then we've had like hundreds of people write to us to say that it's something that they'd like. So buying land and rewilding it is something that people have been thinking about, that they'd like to do for ages but haven't known how to. And we've had like over 120 people sign up as volunteers, who most of whom don't have anything to do with nature normally. So they work in PR or tech or just anything. And they've suddenly decided that how they want to spend, their spare time is by helping a new rewilding charity, because they just saw it and they thought, right, this is what we need. So it's tapping into something new that I think conservation just has managed to miss out on slightly in recent years. And I think, for me, I think the reason is that it's kind of that admitting that we don't really know what's best for nature and allowing nature to decide for itself. I think kind of that sort of common sense element of it, I think people really tap into. So yeah, it's the hope and offering something slightly new.
Yeah, thank you. I will just briefly, I feel I want to stick up for traditional conservation, not just because I work for traditional conservation charities, but because I find a lot of their nature reserves incredibly inspiring, and there is a lot of amazing work that they've done to save a lot of very rare species, and they have done well inspiring people. I definitely agree. They've missed out a section of people. So a few years ago, I went to a rewilding event. It was in Frome, and it was at a cinema, and it was on a weeknight, and it was completely full. There was hundreds of people there. It was incredible, and I kind of thought, if someone like me did a talk on moths or something on a weeknight, I'd probably be lucky to get about 20 people. So clearly, rewilding was a massive draw. It was helped by some of the people they had there as well, like George Monbiot and others who are quite well-known names. So they obviously were attracting a lot of people, but it was also what they were saying. And so I think that it has managed to reach audiences that for some reason conservation charities haven't. And I think that's largely due to the sort of savviness and the communication element. But yeah, I just wanted to make that point. I do think that I don't particularly like it when people frame rewilding as being against traditional conservation. I think they're sort of parts of the same side to a degree. But anyway, that's for later on. One of the positives I just wanted to quickly mention is that I think that because if you take a rewilding method with your site or area, it means you can focus a lot more of your time on monitoring and looking at what species are doing, which is often what conservation charities don't do enough of. But because you're rewilding, you don't have to have reserves officers doing data management and all that kind of thing. You can just focus your time on studying species and seeing what they're doing and learning about the land, which I think is a really, really big positive for the rewilding approach. Right, anyone else want to say something? Charlie?
Yeah, first of all, Hannah, I think you picked a very good time to start your project. It's amazing. So well done. Everyone's obviously on the internet a lot more, and minds are changing in this time. So yeah, I hope it goes really well for you. And I was just going to point out the hopefully obvious, maybe not obvious, positive of the impact on wildlife of projects that are successful. So I just think of NEP because it's the example that I know. The biggest example in the UK, the return of the turtle dove and purple emperor butterfly and whatever else. Yeah, so hopefully an obvious positive, the impact on wildlife.
I come in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, Charlie, I want to say the same thing. I mean, I've been working with pine martins and we've had an amazing success. It's gone from pretty much having no viable population to having about an 80 strong population across Wales. And not only, like you said, amazing for the wildlife, but along the way, Vincent Wildlife has done so much with the community, both with engagement, with conflict mitigation, with shoots and things like that, but then also community engagement to do the fun stuff like camera trap, monitoring and scat surveys, and the community itself, which is quite a diverse mix of, we've got the hippie types that love wildlife and just want to do everything for them, but then we have practical land managers and they want to use their land how they want. They've got a pheasant shoot, they've got lambs, they want practical solutions. And I think a real good positive outcome from our project in particular was being able to bring everyone together, and now everyone's really supportive. And so I find that done well, a good rewilding project can really bring cross-cultural stakeholders together, and I think that's a really good outcome that we can all achieve.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Anyone else? Pete?
Yeah, I think that's following on from that. And I'm going to slightly defy what I said earlier by talking about the project we're starting work on glowworms. Even though glowworms, I don't think you can define as rewilding. They're certainly not changing landscapes. They're not going to build a dam on your land. And, you know, they do thrive in agricultural landscapes. But part of the reason we're going with that species is because it's something that anyone could connect to. You know, I think one that I've mentioned it to it before, but one of the things that really struck me was an episode of Gogglebox where they covered all the different Gogglebox viewers watching a news clip about the reintroduction of checkered skippers to Hampshire. And I love checkered skippers, love all aspects of nature. But that's our bubble, and these are, you know, subsets of general public watching it and are thinking it's just a brown butterfly. Why are they wasting money on that? That was their perception of it, not what a wonderful thing to have the species back. It's like, what's the point? And it's bearing in mind that, you know, you've got this, you know, we can get very stuck in our bubbles, and you need to be working with general public to get them on board. And anyone can see a glow and the way it lights up, and just think, wow, that's fantastic. And if you can get communities, you know, reintroducing glowworms to sites where they have gone extinct, and there isn't a scientifically proven decline now, and a paper came out this year, building up this network across villages, getting parish councils, schools, farmers, landowners get involved in that. And by maintaining glowworms, you have to maintain that sort of rough grass on the side, which then increases more of your insects, more of your bird life. It's what I like to call the natural gateway drugs into the sort of wilder landscape, basically. So yeah, having, you know, these sort of gateway drugs into nature for people generally is so important.
Yeah, thank you. Stuart had to leave, by the way. Then he hasn't just cut out, but I think he didn't want to interrupt you, Pete, to say that. But yeah, he's just had to go. And we have been going now, so if anyone else has to leave, just feel free. But we can go on for as long as people want to. Anyone else want to contribute anything more about positives of rewilding as they see it? Was that Sue? Oh. Oh, okay, sorry, I thought you put your hand up. Anyone? No? Oh, Hannah, yeah.
Just one last point. I do want to reiterate that I totally support conservation, having worked for the Wildlife Trust. And without conservation and management of nature reserves, we wouldn't have anything left to rewild anyway. So we wouldn't have all of these, you know, really, really rare species left, all the butterflies, all of the different flora, you know. So we are indebted to traditional conservation. It's the only reason we can rewild. But I just wanted to sort of make the point, I think that rewilding as a kind of vision has captured people's imagination more than the species specific things, because it makes people think about the destination, what lies ahead for us in the future at a kind of bigger scale. When you think about landscapes, when you think about a long time frame, rather than just, as Peter was saying, one specific species, or what's the point of that? It kind of is a bigger picture kind of engagement. So I think that's probably what rewilding does slightly differently for people. Just wanted to add that. But yay, conservation, it's good.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, Alasdair?
Quickly, I'd say also, I mean, it can be cheap as well. Traditional conservation in the UK has, don't get me wrong, I do support large elements of what, I agree with everything that's been said. I support large elements of what conservation is done, but I think it's become, I think elements of it, not all of it, but elements of it become slightly trapped by thinking of itself almost as an extension of farming. As Pete said, a lot of it's about maintaining low intensity farming systems. They rely on tools of farming, they rely on agri-subsidies. It's quite intensive management, it's quite expensive, you know? And I'm often not sure why, what you know, to what end sometimes, because you know, there are times when conservation is brilliant, and there are times when I think it's maintaining a failed status quo, if I'm brutally honest, in some parts of the countryside. And so I think with things like rewilding, there is a potential to do management very differently, and hopefully on a much cheaper budget, because you don't need hopefully the same degree of intervention at times. Though obviously we'll have costs for all kinds of other stuff as well. Reintroducing species is very expensive, for example, and so on. So, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. If people don't have anything more to add to positives, and I think that was quite a good selection of things there, and it's captured most of the things I was thinking of, we can move on to some of maybe the negatives of rewilding, if everyone's happy with that. Yeah. I'm happy to start. It will come as no surprise to you if some of you have read some of the things I've written on my website, but one of my biggest problems with the negatives of rewilding, which is, I think Stuart touched on it, and Alasdair gave a good response to that, to be fair, is the way in which it's being communicated. Not necessarily what it is it wants to do, but some of the key proponents, such as George Rombo, have communicated the idea of rewilding in quite an aggressive way, and almost been, attacking certain sections of landowners and conservation organisations, which I don't think is very helpful and I've seen it both for myself and my colleagues, in that it's actually actively put people off rewilding who really should be the easiest people to win over to rewilding, like myself and others. Although I am, as an aside, I am a big supporter of rewilding. I do think we need it. But I've seen some of my colleagues get put off by it because of the aggressive way that's being communicated. And I think that was what Stewart was hinting at, in that landowners see it as a dirty word that is associated with quite radical things and also very negative criticisms. And I just think that it is a problem. And I think that some of the key rewilding people need to sort of just take a bit more nuanced and balanced approach. And I think we could be more clever in the way we talk about it, like we are now. We're having really good sort of nuanced, balanced discussion about it in a friendly way. And I think there are some elements of the rewilding movement need to do that, because I think they're putting people off, really. So that's me starting off that section. Anyone want to follow up?
I'll chip in there.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Megan.
As someone in the land management sector, who's on the sort of sharp end of the stick, yeah, I think you're definitely right with the communication side of it. I've had some interesting discussions online. Less in real life, people are a lot less likely to be angsty with you face to face, funnily enough. But online, it can give you a bit, no, it can be very aggressive, actually, the way people put across their arguments and discussions, which doesn't inspire you as an individual to want to work with them at all. We're not, up here, we're not fundamentally opposed to a lot of the rewilding principles. I mean, in terms of sort of estate management, deer management, wildlife management, utilising the natural process is a bonus for what we're doing with this novel. So, you know, you've got an audience of people there who would not be hostile if it was framed in the right way and put across in a way that wasn't confrontational, as though you're the source of all evil in the world. that tends to sour relationships from the off, which I find a bit challenging, even with an open mind to deal with. Things like these are great, you know, to sort of get together. Because you're talking to people who are, you know, quite happy to be human, which is quite nice. And, you know, but yeah, the communication side, especially online, can be hard work and very demoralizing, and you want to disengage from the debate after a bit. Not even the debate, it shouldn't be really a debate, it should be a discussion. That's the state it's at, where it's instantly a debate, you're either for it or against it. So I do find that challenging. On the cost front as well, interestingly, our sort of flagship sort of factoid, our flagship sort of rewilding project at Glenfeshie runs at a loss. It costs an absolute arm and a leg to run it every year, and to rewild it, and to keep deer numbers down and do all the things they wanted to do. So it's not a sort of cost negative enterprise or a cost neutral enterprise. It's if Andrews Paulson wasn't a multi-billionaire, it would be unsustainable. So I'm sort of, maybe on a smaller scale, the rewilding might not have the cost concern, but on large scale landscape stuff, it's expensive. So that's my bit.
Cool, thank you. Charlie, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think the contentiousness or the potential for disagreement is a negative. I hope you don't mind me saying, Pete and Simon, but well, I don't think you'll mind me saying that we've all been involved with AFON, a Focus on Nature, the UK's Youth Nature Network. But online, we have ended up kind of disagreeing. I don't know if I'd go as far as arguing. I'd be interested to hear if either of you have different descriptions of, I'm thinking quite a while ago, but it got to the point where I was like, well, why does Pete think that? I can't believe he doesn't agree with what's being said. And, you know, it almost turned into an argument because you're typing and we're not having a conversation face to face. So just to back up what you said, Megan, I hope you don't mind me saying that, Simon and Pete.
No, I mean, to be fair, I don't remember that being an argument at all. Maybe my standards for what's a heated argument are different. So for me, I thought that was quite a pleasant discussion back then.
Yeah, but it just makes it clear how tone of voice and facial expression are so important in human communication. If you don't have a little emoji or something like that, or an exclamation mark or whatever, it can seem really sort of dark and, you know, over sincere. But yeah, I don't remember it ever sort of like, yeah.
Okay, That was just me seeing it like that. I was talking to my boyfriend Marcus over breakfast about this call. He's working upstairs, else he might have joined. And it got heated between the two of us. Yeah, so it is potentially a heated whatever topic.
Yeah, Alasdair.
I totally agree with the thing about online. Every issue I'm involved with, online conversations are horrible. Whether it's climate change, renewables, personal stuff, I don't do Facebook anymore because I was starting to fight with my friends about stupid stuff. It's just something about it leads to fights. And I'm going to slightly defend George Monbiot though. First of all, because I think Farrell did a fantastic job of kicking open the doors of this issue, which has been dormant for a while. Also, he's a campaigner. I'm a campaigner. And he's a certain kind of campaigner. You know, he's not a campaigner who's going to get down into the detail of spreadsheets and getting his hands in the dirt of actually building the project. He's a campaigner in terms of making headlines and arguing a point, and he does that very well, I think. So he may have a detrimental effect in some areas of the conversation, but I think he's done a good job, you know, in that sort of top level stuff and inspiring people. I would just come back to my earlier point that obviously people can always communicate things better. But one of the challenges I think we have with all these issues, and my other main job has been for many years in climate and energy issues, is that very often actually what we do want is quite significant change. And we play this little game where we tiptoe around that and pretend that we can all actually have everything everyone wants, and that's fine. And if we just do that, then everyone can agree. But actually, you know, rewilding, renewables was like that. People would say, oh, I hate renewables because, and actually the reason they hated them was because they wouldn't get to burn as much coal or gas. That was really the big problem. Nothing else was actually the issue. And so with rewilding, it's a bit different, it's more complicated, but, you know, people say, oh, rewilding is such an unpopular term. And I come back to my original point, you know, for a lot of those people, the NFU, the Sheep Farmers Association, etc., the Forestry Association, it's always going to be unpopular. Because ultimately what it means is people are arguing that we want less sheep, fewer sheep in the mountains, or we want, you know, fewer fish caught in the oceans and no take zones, or we want, you know, fewer plantation forests, etc. That's actually what we're saying when it comes down to it. For the same reason that when you're arguing about pesticides, you're saying we want to use fewer pesticides. So the NFU get furious about that and say you're being unreasonable. And can we not all just work together and be, you know, have a compromise? So sometimes you can compromise and you can compromise on specific areas, but, you know, ultimately rewilding is going to be controversial because it is about a significant change in the philosophy of land use. So I think on a personal level and on a specific project level, there's always compromises. But, you know, you can't compromise and say, oh, actually, yes, you can do rewilding and still keep all your sheep in the mountains. You can't really. They're just two opposing views of something. What you can compromise on is say, we can have, instead of having, you know, for argument's sake, 70% of our countryside is used for animal agriculture, we might compromise and say it's only going to be 50%. That would be a compromise. You know, right now there is no rewilding, essentially. The amount of rewilding that's happening on a national scale is very small, percentage-wise, with few people in the call accepted. Particularly in England, it's very small. So, you know, the compromise is always, you know, it should be to move towards having some rewilding, and that will always be controversial, I think.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, because whilst I am a big fan of being as nuanced and as inclusive as you can in the way you talk about things, I also think that obviously we are so out of balance with nature in this country, and we do need to take some land out of agricultural production and give it back to nature. And that is in itself, as you say, Alasdair, for large sections of certain bodies, a controversial thing, because but for me, you have to explore how you do that, and how you go about it. And I think, and I will still maintain that the methods that George Bobo uses are not the right way to go about it. Although I do agree that Farrell was a good book, and it was one book that helped me a lot get into this issue. But I think a lot of his stuff since then, publishing in The Guardian, has been terrible. But anyway, so anyone else want to come on? Pete? Yeah.
And I think on that note, I don't think you're really going to have any sort of viable long-term big wilding area in the country until you have it on big state-owned lands. Certainly in the English context, and the Scottish context, majority of projects talk about in Britain are private landowners, whether it is Anders Povsen, as Megan's mentioned, or Charley Burrell of Knepp, or the estate in Norfolk, Sunnington Estate, another one's popping up in Cornwall. They're all basically the whim of one landowner or a group of landowners. If Charley's heir decides that they don't want to do wild anymore, all of the great stuff's happening at Knepp, it's gone. There's no security in that. And so therefore the only chance you're going to have big areas of long-term viability, which you need with wilding, because it's about scale and time, is if it was owned by the state. And then for the state to make that decision to take areas out of production or with very or relatively little production is going to be a very, very, very bold political move, and it'll take some big will to do that. So that's part of the difficulty you're in. In America, you know, there wasn't really that baseline of low intensity agriculture. So, you know, their idea of wild was wilderness basically. And even then, that's still built upon a lot of contention, social issues when you look at the terms of like Native American rights and what have you. So there's still a lot of contention there, but their baseline was wilderness areas. We don't have that baseline of wilderness areas culturally in the UK. So it's even more difficult to have that going forward. So yeah, very complex.
Cool. Anyone else want to say anything on what's been said? Hannah?
Just to add to that really, so on top of my list when I wrote kind of negatives was that kind of ordinary people can't really do it depending on how you define it. So quite a lot of people have written to us at HEAL and said that the reason they're supporting us is that rewilding is something that they've wanted to do for ages but don't know how or don't have the money to do, or you know, not everyone can just buy some land and rewild it like they want to, and often that's the kind of end feeling of reading Wilding or reading Feral, feeling really energized to do something but not actually being able to. And then the other kind of negative as well is that because it's low intervention, it's really hard for people to actually get involved with a rewilding project. So loads of people have written to us and said, "Oh, add us to your list for practical volunteers." Well, that, you know, apart from when you get the site and originally have to take some fences down and do some works at the beginning, the idea is to do as little as possible. So that's really hard to help people feel like they're a part of it. And we've been speaking to the team at Knepp about, you know, various issues they've had to overcome, and they say that they have the longest list ever of people who have written to them and said, "These are my skills, I'd love to volunteer," but there's just so few opportunities for people to get involved. So that's one of, you know, it's kind of up to the wealthy landowners or people who are in the estates, and it's really difficult to help people feel like they're part of it.
Oh, thank you. I think Charley, you wanted to say something, didn't you?
Yeah, just that, yeah, it's recording really, isn't it? Just monitoring. And speaking to Penny Green, who's the ecologist at Knepp, I know she's got a huge list of volunteers, probably most of them relatively low skills. So I know they pair people up. Like I went along to a winter bird survey and I was paired up with someone who actually knew about winter birds a bit more than me. But yeah, what people like is getting out and doing practical work. Lots of people, not everyone. So yeah, I just agree with you, Hannah, I think is what I'm saying. But oh yeah, and that I don't think they particularly like just casual records because they want everything to be at Knepp, understandably, like nationally recognised and standard methodologies so that they can be repeated over years and years, decades even. And that's not something that just any old volunteer can turn up and do. So yeah, I see that limitation as well.
Cool. Well, we could move on to the next part unless anyone else had any more sort of negatives or things they wanted to talk about with regards to that. No? Oh, yes, Julie.
So I'm coming in from a really ignorant perspective, and I'm just wondering about food production in terms of if in a situation where we're going in rewilding, we want people to do as little as possible. Is there not another way of swinging it to bring in, well, this is what you can do in terms of if you're growing your own vegetables and if you're you can be actively involved with the land on this side while we're leaving that side to do its own thing. So isn't there like a balance that we can bring in that keeps people connected to the land and making their compost and returning to the land to be part of it?
I would just say totally agree. And one of my big thoughts has always been on the urban stuff, that as we rewild the countryside, we should refarm the cities to try and really explicitly make that link for people that, you know, if you're doing this here, it means less needed there. Also, not everyone wants to hear it, but eat less meat helps too. If you're talking about that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Julie and Alasdair. I actually thought, oh, sorry, Megan, I'll just quickly say this and then you can help me. I thought, Julie, you were going to say that there were the issues with food production in terms of loss of food production if we started rewilding, which is another criticism I've seen people give, but there are sort of points that you could put back to that. But anyway, that wasn't the point that you made. Megan, what did you want to say?
I was going to say, I think this whole COVID-19 thing is going to provide an interesting flip. On one hand, we've got, you know, it's sort of almost forceful rewilding. In a lot of places, you're seeing animals exploring around, going around places, barrages growing, all this sort of stuff, very instant effect. But I think in the long term, what's concerning me and what should be probably concerning this sort of rewilding idea is the food markets, is food processes, the supply chains. I mean, we're sort of, you know, in the West, sort of going, right, we're getting past COVID-19, that's great. But what about when it hits our countries that we import our food from, who haven't got the NHS and all these other systems to support them? What about, I mean, the United Nations talking about 265 million people going hungry around the world. I mean, so I'm agreeing with Julie, and it would be quite good to reincorporate people into the food systems, and like you said, land sharing, land sparing kind of mix. You know, the less reliance we have on other countries who also have their own important key biodiversity. I mean, you're looking at these tropical rainforests. In an acre there compared to an acre in the north of Scotland, it's thousands of times more biodiverse there than it is here. But we get very excited about a few acres of birchwood in Scotland when we're actually looking at deforestation in these areas to grow food for us. There's all these systems that I think this virus is going to throw into light, actually, as we go forward. You know, it's very easy to get excited about what's happening in this country, but not looking at the systems that then support us around the world. So I don't know if that made any sense at all, but I'm sort of just like mumbling through. But yeah, that's kind of what I think this whole situation could actually throw into light, both positively and negatively.
Yeah, no, that did make sense, Megan. We've almost been on the call an hour and a half. Do people want to carry on for a little bit more? There are only maybe one other point on the list anyway that I sent through. Are people happy to go on for a bit more? Yeah? Oh, Alasdair's got to go. Does everyone else want to carry on for a little bit more, or do we want to try and sort of finish?
I want to finish around 12, maybe a few minutes longer. But
yeah, okay. Well, I mean, as we've only got a few minutes left, does anyone just want to say any closing remarks? And also, I'd love to know, but you can always email this to me if you thought this went well and you want to do it again. Maybe send me some future topics, because I'll send emails around to organise another one. We can talk about different things. But does anyone have anything else to say, basically? No, it's silence now.
thank you, Simon, for setting this up. It's been really good. Really enjoyed it.
Cool.
Yep, thank you very much. I just realised that's probably the first rewilding discussion I've been in, which didn't mention beavers. Woo!
Ah!
Was a first.
I just wanted to add that I was having a conversation with Chris Sandham at Sussex Uni, who runs a rewilding module there. And he says that he's really excited about the fact that everyone is doing rewilding differently, because it's producing a diversity of its own kind. So the fact that we all disagree to various different extents is actually a good thing because it produces a variety of outcomes. So it's all good.
I like that.
Cool.
I think that it's, I mean, Pete, was it Pete that said about, you know, in this country, I mean, we're a union of 4 countries, so you're going to have different approaches are going to suit. So, I mean, geez, between the south of Scotland and the north of Scotland, you've got different approaches. Between different counties, different watersheds, different soil types. So we're going to have to find different solutions and different options for different areas, rather than saying, in Britain, we are going to do X, and everyone's going to do it this way. It's not going to work. So we, you know, that's a really good point, Hannah. Actually, that the fact we have got that diversity of views, everyone's struggling for a definition of what rewilding is, but it could actually be quite a useful thing that we have that diversity of opinions and views and approaches, because it will suit each area and its own particular way.
Yeah, no, that is true. That's a very good point. But no, thank you all for coming and keeping me company on my furlough. I've really enjoyed it, and yeah, I hope that we can do another one on a different topic maybe next week. But I'll send you all emails about that. So yeah, and I hope you've all found this really interesting. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for organising.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.